Winter in New York was not as cold as Ethan Whitmore's eyes. They say when people stand on the edge of death, they cling to life more than ever. But not Ethan, the man who owned the third largest financial empire in America, who now sat in a VIP hospital room, expressionless, as though each beat of his heart was nothing more than a borrowed tick, just moments away from expiring. The chief cardiologist, a man who had treated senators, celebrities, and dignitaries, stood by Ethan's bed, eyes full of worry. The latest test result was in his hand, printed on glossy paper, yet bleaker than the gray sky outside. If you don't undergo surgery within the next 2 weeks, the risk of sudden death is extremely high. Ethan didn't look up. He merely muttered, "I've already signed my will." The doctor sighed. He wasn't surprised. It was the third time he'd brought up surgery, and the third time Ethan had flatly refused. Ethan Whitmore, 41, was known as the iceberg of Wall Street. No wife, children, or known relatives. Not a single family photo ever captured by the press. He lived alone atop a glass tower in a penthouse spanning hundreds of square meters, yet not a single framed memory adorned the walls. People said his heart was made of stone. Ironically, it was that very heart that was betraying him first. In the spacious hospital room, the cold white light cast a pale glow over his lifeless skin. Beside him, an IV dripped in silence. The heart monitor beeped steadily, beep, beep, like a countdown to the end. Ethan stared out the large window where snow had begun to fall quietly. Everything outside was painfully beautiful. But inside him, every emotion had long died. He didn't fear death. He had prepared for it at 30, the one day he had cried until his body collapsed, watching the lifeless form of his younger brother Connor after a tragic accident. An accident Ethan believed was his fault. He didn't seek religion, didn't need prayers. What he craved was silence, complete, undisturbed silence. Because for too many years now, Ethan had stopped believing that life had anything left worth holding on to. That afternoon, a new face joined the nursing shift, Amara Jackson, a young black woman whose steps were soft as wind eyes glowing with a quiet gentleness. No one told her to stay silent around Ethan, but she did, instinctively sensing the invisible walls he had built around himself. She checked his temperature, adjusted the IV, and recorded his vitals. Every motion precise and calm, without a single unnecessary word. As she quietly left the room, Ethan looked up for the first time that day. Just a fleeting moment. But that look in her eyes, that quiet presence, left a faint glimmer in his otherwise shadowed mind. That evening, when nurses gathered in the break room, trading stories about complex patients, one of them whispered, "Mr. Whitmore refused to eat again, didn't he?" Amara smiled without replying. She glanced down at the medical chart where the notes read, "Patient declines all psychological support." She understood. Sometimes hearts that shut love out aren't doing so because they no longer need affection, but because the fear of opening up only to lose it again is unbearable. Ethan sat up in the middle of the night. A sharp pain gripped his chest. He gasped for air. His hand reached for the emergency button, then stopped. No. He didn't want anyone to see him weak. He leaned his head against the bed frame and closed his eyes. And for the first time in a faint dream, he felt a hand on his chest. A small, warm hand, the color of golden honey. And in that dream, his heart beat again. Slowly, calmly. We don't get to choose when our hearts break, but sometimes it only takes a look. A perfectly timed silence, and a shattered heart may begin to hope again. Do you believe that even the loneliest, strongest man only needs one person arriving at the right moment to make him want to live again? If you're listening to this story, drop a like to strengthen hearts on the edge of surrender. If you've ever believed that love can start from the smallest moment, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe as we continue to follow the quiet but powerful journey between Ethan and Amara. Because behind a life or death surgery lies a love waiting to be reborn. The early winter wind slid across the massive glass panes of Whitestone Memorial Hospital, leaving behind the city's breath fogging the surface. In room 1701 on the 17th floor, Ethan still lay there unmoving, as if time had become meaningless. A few nurses passed by their rubber soles, echoing with rhythmic taps. But today, something was different in those footsteps. Softer, slower. It was like someone was walking through a cathedral where silence wasn't emptiness, but reverence. Amara Jackson paused before the door marked 1701. There was no call, no signal inviting her in. Still, she knocked 3 times lightly, then pushed the door open with a motion so gentle it seemed to fear disturbing the air itself. The first look Ethan gave her wasn't one of someone seeking help. It was cold, silent, sharp as glass, tucked behind steel gray blue eyes. He was leaning back against the pillow facing the window and turned to her only briefly, as if to confirm she wasn't anyone important. Amara said nothing. She pulled on her gloves, adjusted her mask, and stepped closer. Her hands were slightly cool, but her movements were gentle. She checked the heart monitor, adjusted the IV, and jotted notes on the digital chart. No small talk. No rehearsed smiles. There was something about her, a silence not born of fear but choice. Like a piano playing softly in a deserted hospital corridor, not loud, but somehow everyone still stops to listen. Ethan looked again. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her wrist where a small black bracelet rested, its engraving nearly faded. Still I rise. He didn't ask about it, but for a brief moment, his mind slowed. Strangely, for the first time in days, the presence of a stranger didn't feel like an intrusion. Amara stepped out, not long after leaving behind a faint trace of lavender. Ethan kept looking at the door. This time, not the city beyond the window, but the space where she had just disappeared. He closed his eyes, drifting into a nameless void. In his restless sleep, he heard a woman's voice, husky and low, a lullaby hauntingly familiar, like his mother's. Day 2. Amara returned right on schedule. Still no introduction. She merely nodded when Ethan glanced at her with his tired face. "Thought they reassigned you," Ethan muttered, his voice rough from a heavy sleep. Amara tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes catching the soft glow of morning light. "I'm still here," she replied, calm, quiet, like a promise that required no effort to keep. Ethan said nothing more. But that day, for the first time, he let her take his blood pressure without pulling his arm away. Amara had a way of touching things without making them feel invaded. From replacing IV bags to straightening a shifted blanket, every motion held a respect that didn't need words. Not overly gentle, not coldly distant, just enough. Ethan began to notice her more, not in the way a man notices a woman, but in the way a lost soul notices a patch of ground soft enough to rest upon. On day 3, he suddenly asked, "How old are you?" Amara smiled. She was writing something in her notes, but looked up, her gaze neither shy nor proud. Old enough to know the value of silence, and young enough to still believe a single look can heal. Ethan froze, not because of the answer, but because he had never imagined someone still believed in a look. That evening, Amara didn't come. The shifts had changed. Another nurse entered, younger, talkative, louder. Ethan turned his face to the wall. For 30 minutes, he refused to let anyone touch him. Every time the new nurse touched his forehead to check his temperature, he brushed it away. He didn't know why. But the hand didn't feel right. It wasn't her. In a world where everything is measured in numbers, time, and money, Ethan experienced something that logic couldn't define. The absence of one person after just 3 days left a void he couldn't ignore, and so he waited. He didn't speak of it, didn't admit it, but every time the door opened, he turned to look. And when it wasn't Amara, he turned back to the window. They say the strangest thing isn't loving someone for too long. It's missing someone before you even know who they are. Ethan didn't know what Amara had been through, didn't know where she was from, didn't know why she chose nursing over something easier. But he knew one thing. When she entered the room, his heart slowed, and when she wasn't there, it began to ache. In that silence, something was taking shape. Not loud, not defined, but certain. Something that made a heart once unwilling to heal begin to waver. That morning, sunlight couldn't reach the 17th floor hospital room. The fluorescent lights kept the space bright enough, but only accentuated Ethan Whitmore's pale skin and tired under eyes. He hadn't slept. His eyes had remained open all night, fixed on the ceiling, as if he could count every invisible crack. Old dreams returned, blurring the line between memory and illusion. The accident. His brother's scream before the car slammed into the barrier. Then silence. A silence that had stretched for years, not just around him, but inside his chest. Ethan had never shared that pain with anyone. Not because no one wanted to listen, but because he no longer believed accurate understanding existed. He had lived among fake handshakes, binding contracts, and hollow compliments. The higher he climbed, the lonelier it became. And then in the stillness, a voice smooth, low, velvet-like drifted through the barely ajar door. Amara was speaking. Not to him, but to an elderly patient in the room next door. Her voice was soft, gentle, but carried a strange kind of power, just enough to reach corners long untouched. You know, some people seem so strong, but they hurt the most inside. They don't cry, they don't plead, they don't complain. They stay silent, as if silence is the only thing they can control in their lives. Ethan didn't breathe. Every sense in him was anchored to the sound of her voice. The words not addressed to him, not naming him, somehow slipped through the glass past the door and soaked into his chest like they were made for him. But I believe everyone needs someone willing to listen, even when they say nothing. Silence. The room held its breath. Ethan turned his face inward. The gray blue in his eyes wasn't cold anymore. It held something unnamed, a fragile thing, part hope, part regret. At noon, Amara entered his room as usual. She had no idea what Ethan had overheard. Her expression remained calm. Her eyes were bright and patient. Ethan said nothing at first, but he watched her more closely. Her hair was tied neatly with a few loose strands brushing her temple. Her hands were slightly calloused, the mark of years of labor. Her white uniform, though simple, carried a quiet purity untainted by the world. I used to think nurses were just supposed to follow orders, he said softly, like the wind. Amara looked up, slightly surprised by his voice, but she didn't answer right away. But you're not like that. He continued, his tone steady. You don't try to smile. You don't try to make me feel better. You show up. Amara smiled. Not out of surprise. Not even out of joy. Just a gentle smile, as if she had been waiting a long time to hear someone say that. I believe presence is sometimes enough, she said quietly. Not to fix anyone, just to let them know they haven't been forgotten. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to keep his guard up. That afternoon, Amara sat in the break room, flipping through a small notebook. On its pages were handwritten quotes, a habit she'd kept since nursing school. A colleague walked in and raised a brow. Writing again. Was Whitmore's shift quiet today? Amara nodded. Quiet. But the quiet that makes you listen to yourself. That night, Ethan didn't stare out the window like usual. He propped himself up, his gaze drifting across the still room until it landed on a small table where a tray of chamomile tea sat. Amara had quietly placed it there that morning. No one asked her to. No one knew whether Ethan ever drank it. But each day, a new cup appeared like a message with no words. I know you're here. And I'm still here too. Ethan touched the rim of the cup. The tea had cooled. But a strange warmth lingered in his palm, not from the liquid, but from the person who had left it there. He lay back down and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't try to forget. He let the memories come, the pain, the emptiness, and the image of a curly-haired nurse whose eyes didn't seek to study him. But somehow I understood him completely. In his dream, he stood in a room filled with light. Across the space, Connor, his younger brother, smiled. But just as Ethan moved forward, another hand gently stopped him. There were no words, just a hand holding his warm and soft. And in that dream, Ethan wasn't afraid. The next morning, when Amara opened the door, Ethan was already awake. This time, he didn't turn away. He looked straight into her eyes, those deep, dark wood eyes that reflected something he had long believed dead faith. And in that single moment, though no one said a word, Ethan's forgotten heart was finally heard. The hospital at night was not entirely silent. The sounds of machines, the scattered footsteps of night shift nurses, the soft rustling of restless patients in their uneasy dreams, all wove together into a symphony that felt distant and quietly sorrowful. On the 17th floor, the special isolation ward, that symphony faded even more, leaving behind a still space that felt like a forgotten world. Time didn't pass there. It pressed down moment by moment. Amara strolled down the long corridor. Her shift had ended 2 hours ago, but instead of returning to the dorms, she had poured herself a cup of hot tea in the nurses' lounge. She didn't offer a reason. She simply wasn't ready to leave. Something in the air tonight felt wrong. A faint instinct like somewhere nearby a soul was about to break and no one knew. Behind the door of room 1701, Ethan was still awake. He hadn't spoken to anyone that day, didn't respond to doctors, refused food, just lay there staring at the ceiling like he was counting every lonely beat of his failing heart. But when night fell, the thing he had spent all day suppressing surged forward sudden and merciless, like a wave crashing over a fragile shore. It hit without warning. Pain seized his chest, like invisible hands clenching around his already fractured heart. Ethan sat up, reaching with trembling fingers for the emergency button, then paused. His first instinct wasn't to call for help. It was to endure like always. He collapsed back onto the bed, gasping. His lips turned pale. Sweat poured cold down his back. The suffocating pressure drowned him as though he were sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And in that moment, he realized how truly alone he was. The door burst open. No alarms, no warnings, just Amara hair loosely falling at her neck, eyes wide with the ache of intuition. She didn't ask what was wrong, didn't cry out. She rushed to his side, her hands moving like wind, checking vitals, oxygen, and blood pressure. "Ethan, look at me." Her voice wasn't loud, but something in it made his fading eyes hold on, clinging to the light in hers, like a drowning man clutching a twig in a flood. "Don't fight. Breathe with me. 1, 2, 3. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his erratic heart, and sent through it a different rhythm. Steady, warm, alive. And strangely, he didn't pull her hand away. That moment, cold night, sterile machines, the hush of isolation. Her hand on his chest was no longer just a medical gesture. It became something primal, a connection between two heartbeats, one faltering, one silently lending its strength. Ethan couldn't speak, but the way he looked at her, it was no longer the gaze of a man who had rejected life. It was the gaze of a boy held tightly in the middle of a nightmare. Amara leaned closer, her lips near his ear. "You don't have to be strong. Alone." The whisper pierced him gently, like a needle to the center of a frozen heart, a place untouched for years. 12 minutes. Just 12 minutes, standing between life and death. And the walls Ethan had spent years building began to crack. The heart monitor steadied. His forehead still glistened with sweat, but his breaths came deeper, smoother. His eyes closed. Not from unconsciousness, but because, for the first time, he could let his defenses fall. Amara remained by his bedside. She held his hand, the same hand that once commanded boardrooms, built empires, ruled with steel. Now it trembled, but it did not resist. That hand for the first time belonged to no one powerful, no billionaire. Just a man fragile and finally willing to be held. When the doctors arrived, Ethan was asleep. Asleep so deep, so peaceful, it seemed untouched by years of insomnia. Amara gently slipped her hand away and stood. But then, his fingers grasped hers. Barely there, like a feather landing on skin. "Don't leave. Not yet." He didn't open his eyes, just whispered. Amara didn't respond. She sat down again, eyes closing softly. And in the cold wind slipping through the window's edge, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be, at the exact right moment, for someone who finally wasn't alone. Outside the room, the head cardiologist murmured to his assistant, "He's out of crisis, but I don't understand." There was no emergency intervention. What kept him going? The assistant glanced at the hallway camera, where they saw Amara sitting beside Ethan, her hand in his. Both of them quiet, as if breathing in the same rhythm. Some things, doctor, medicine can't measure. That night, the cold isolation room on the 17th floor became something else. Not just a ward, not a cell. It became the beginning of something achingly real, something that had no name yet, no need for declarations, just a single breath, and someone who chose to stay. Morning light slipped gently through the white curtains, brushing against the cold corners of the hospital room where Ethan still slept, wrapped in the stillness that followed the heart attack the night before. Amara stood quietly by the window, vitals chart in hand, her gaze drifting toward the bed, contemplative, nameless. Last night had left her with more than an emergency response. It had left a quiet shift within her. As she placed the chart back on the shelf, her eyes happened to pass over the small bedside table usually overlooked. There, tucked beside a heart medication box and a few worn medical journals, was a photograph, unframed, faded, barely holding on to its color. She froze. In the photo were two boys, one around 10, the other perhaps 8. Blonde hair, bright smiles, arms slung over each other's shoulders on a lush green lawn. A peaceful moment, as if time had never yet learned how to wound. Amara knew instantly that the older boy was Ethan. Even smiling, there was a strange solemnity in his eyes, like someone who never quite allowed himself to surrender fully to joy. And the younger one so full of light, a smile so unguarded. Who was he? "Don't touch that!" The voice came from behind, not angry but firm. Amara turned, startled. Ethan was awake, lying on his side, eyes wide open, and locked on her, not defensive, but not without that quiet layer of deeply ingrained caution. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wasn't going to." "It's fine," Ethan said, turning his head to the ceiling. "It's just, That photo isn't for anyone else. Amara didn't say another word. She set the photo down gently, as if it were fragile glass. A long silence passed. Something in Ethan was warring with itself, between holding it in and finally letting it go. At last his voice came rough and low. "That's Connor. My younger brother." The words floated into the air, soft as breath, heavy as winter wind. Amara sat in the chair beside the bed, saying nothing. She knew some wounds only speak when someone is quiet long enough to listen. Ethan continued, eyes still on the ceiling. "He was the last good part of our family. Funny, hopeful, everything I wasn't. He had this way of making things softer. He died in a car accident. I was 30. A silence so deep it pressed into the walls. "We fought that day," he whispered. "He said I was obsessed with work. I told him he was irresponsible and didn't know how to live in the real world. He stormed off, and the car lost control." His voice cracked not with volume, but with weight. "I got to the scene right after they took his body away. Someone handed me the necklace he wore. On the back it was engraved, 'You're the one I'll always believe in.'" He turned his head to look at Amara. No rage, no wild grief, just eyes that had been burnt into ash by time. "I couldn't save him, and I haven't forgiven myself since." Amara felt a chill rise quietly through her chest. Not because of the story, but because of the way he said it. Like he'd been living the last 10 years with a heart no longer allowed to beat for its own sake. She lowered her gaze, sat in silence. "Is that why you don't want the surgery?" she asked. Ethan let out a faint smirk, not a smile, but something twisted with sorrow. "It's not that I don't want to. I don't see a reason worth surviving for." Amara nodded gently. She understood. Some people don't fear death. They only fear living, with a heart no longer knowing who or what it should beat for. She stood, walked to the table and made chamomile tea. She didn't ask if he wanted it. She just placed it there like every other day, quiet, present, unwavering. Before leaving, she turned to him. Her eyes were soft, but carried the weight of truth. "Connor believed in you." Ethan looked up. "And I believe. Faith is the one thing that doesn't die if you choose to keep it alive." After she left, Ethan lay still for a long time, eyes open, but seeing nothing. The photo remained on the table like a blade lodged in memory. But something was different. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't look away. Instead, he reached for it. Slowly, deliberately, as if afraid to drop a piece of his soul. On the back of the photo, the inked handwriting was still clear. "To the one who always carries my heart even when I'm gone." Ethan closed his eyes, and from somewhere deep inside his chest, a single sob escaped short, nearly soundless. But his heart heard it loud and clear. It rained that afternoon. A thin, lingering rain trailed down the hospital windows, like memories moving slowly across glass. Amara returned for her afternoon shift. She didn't care if the weather was cold, or her hours stretched longer than planned, because ever since that night, her heart no longer allowed her to remain outside the story of the man with silver eyes, who looked like snowfall was always coming. Ethan sat upright in bed. No one had asked him to. There was no medical recommendation, but he did it anyway, as if preparing for something he couldn't name, but knew was drawing near. Amara entered quietly as she always did. Never too fast, never too slow, but always exactly on time. She set a folded towel on the bedside table, then pulled out the blood pressure cuff. As her hand lightly touched his arm, just enough to wrap the cuff around it, Ethan suddenly pushed her hand away. Not harshly, but firmly. "Stop," he said, voice low, colder than usual. "I can do that myself." Amara looked up. She didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised or hurt. Only still her gaze holding a quiet depth, as if she'd always known this moment would come. "You need to be checked," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a breath. Ethan let out a dry laugh. It wasn't amusement. It was a scratch across the surface of his face, thin and sharp. "You think I don't know all of this? It's just protocol. Just boxes to check, to make it look like someone still gives a damn. But no one does. Not you. Not anyone." That last line came out differently, not laced with bitterness anymore. It sounded closer to despair. Amara didn't move. Her hand rested gently against the bed frame. Wind slipped through the window crack, brushing her curls. But her face didn't change. Only her eyes deepened, like still water hiding something vast beneath. "I don't pity you, Ethan," she said slowly. "I see you." Ethan stilled. 2 seconds passed, but they stretched like lifetimes. She didn't explain, didn't soften her words, didn't try to make them more palatable. She said what she meant like an arrow straight into the part of him still hidden beneath all that proud armor. He turned his face toward the window. See what? A rich, arrogant man who never learned how to live. Someone who let his brother die. A weak patient, waiting for someone to feel sorry for him. Amara didn't move closer. She didn't need to. Her words had already reached him. I see a man exhausted from holding himself up like a monument. A man who's hurting, not because his heart is failing, but because it's never been allowed to heal. I'm not here out of pity. I stayed because I recognized that look in your eyes. Ethan turned back to face her. In his silver gaze, something flickered, not a challenge, but disbelief. As if he couldn't fathom someone saying those words and not wanting something in return. Why, he asked quietly, why would you recognize it? Amara gave a small smile, not sad, not cheerful, just the truth. Because I once had that look too. A long silence filled the room. In that moment, there were no roles, no nurse, no patient. Just two people standing on either side of an old wound, looking at each other through scars. Finally, Ethan lowered his hand. Do your job. It was a simple phrase, but to Amara it was rare permission, a sign that maybe, just maybe. The lock was starting to turn. She stepped forward again and rewrapped the cuff around his arm. This time he didn't pull away. The monitor whirred to life. The numbers blinked on the screen. And Ethan watched her hands. Long fingers, strong knuckles, soft but calloused at the tips. That hand had held his during a heart attack. That hand not out of duty, but something more. After the checkup, Amara packed the equipment back into the box. Then he gently wiped his forehead with a warm cloth. No questions, no comfort words, just instinct from someone who knew another was weary. Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time, he let someone touch him, without recoiling. On the bedside table, the old photo of Connor still lay where it always did. But this time, Amara didn't glance at it. She didn't need to. She had begun to understand. No one survives grief without breaking somewhere inside. But sometimes a heart doesn't need to be healed right away. Sometimes, it just needs to be seen. Not feared, not pitied, just seen. And reminded, I see you, and I'm still here. Day 17, since Ethan Whitmore was admitted, began with a closed-door meeting in the office of the head of cardiology. Dr. Hamilton, seasoned, sharp-featured with a no-nonsense stare, placed Ethan's file on the polished mahogany desk. His voice was composed, but the tension behind it was palpable. We can't delay any longer. His heart rate is steadily declining. If we don't intervene, any night could be his last. the surgeon, head nurse, and anesthesiologist. They all nodded. The operation was prepared. Personnel, equipment, post-op isolation unit, all set. Only one thing remained: the patient's signature. And Ethan, as if sensing the machinery moving beneath him, lay silent in his room. His eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling. His mind wasn't empty. On the contrary, it was thick with invisible noise, a tearing conflict. That afternoon, Dr. Hamilton came to see him in person. In his hand, the surgical consent form. His voice was steady yet firm. "We're planning to operate this Friday. I need your signature so we can begin protocol." Ethan didn't look up. His gaze stayed trapped somewhere in the air, a spot no one else could see. "It's not necessary." The doctor paused. He'd dealt with stubborn patients, with fear, with denial, with avoidance. But Ethan was different. He wasn't afraid to die. He saw no reason to live. "Do you understand what's waiting for you if you don't do this?" "I do," Ethan said quietly. "I've understood for a long time." After the doctor left, a heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the afternoon rain hadn't stopped since yesterday. A delicate, misty veil clung to the windows, as if the sky was slowly slipping into release. Amara entered. She knew. Dr. Hamilton had told her everything. But she wasn't coming as a nurse today. Not to check vitals. Not to adjust an IV. Today she was the only person who could reach a heart that had locked away. She carried nothing. No clipboard. No tray. Only a gaze still quiet like a lake after a midnight storm. "I heard you refused," she said gently. Ethan still stared out the window. His reflection wavered on the glass, as if even he was just a fading outline. "I've signed so many things in my life," he said slowly. "Signed to start a company. Signed to close it. Signed to sell my fortune. Signed to bury my brother. But this time, I don't see a reason to sign anymore." Amara didn't respond right away. She stepped closer, standing beside his bed so near that only a breath separated them. "You still have a reason," she whispered. Ethan turned to her. His eyes held no anger, no coldness, only fatigue stretched out from the past. "What reason? To keep living a life I don't want. To exist just long enough for people to try to take more from me." "You're living in a prison you built yourself," Amara replied. "No one locked you in. You just never allowed yourself to be forgiven." That made Ethan blink. A tremor of something brief but real passed across his face. Forgiven by who, he asked, nearly desperate. "Myself." "Yes," she nodded. "And by this life. For keeping you in the dark for so long." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly. Not loud enough to startle, but impossible to ignore. It sounded like the voice inside Ethan. "These are not yet words, but they are rising slowly from deep beneath." Amara sat at the edge of the bed. She didn't touch him, didn't reach for his hand. She was there, unmoving, unafraid. "You know," she said softly, "I once had a sister. She battled bone cancer for 3 years. And when the doctor said there was still a chance with surgery, she refused. I asked why. She said, because you're the only one who still needs me. And I'm afraid I won't be strong enough to be that version of me anymore." Ethan didn't reply. But for the first time in hours, his eyes dropped to his hands, thin, time-worn, trembling slightly. "My sister died," Amara continued, "but I still believe. If someone had been there that day, not as a doctor, not as family, but as a listener, she might have said yes." She looked at him. Her voice was low but clear. "And I don't want that to happen to you." The room held its breath. Only the IV's gentle drip broke the stillness. Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them again, it wasn't to answer. It was to retreat. "It's not fear," he whispered. "I'm just tired." Amara nodded. She understood. It wasn't physical tiredness. It was the kind that came from a lifetime of living with a heart that had rejected hope. Then let your heart rest, truly rest. Don't let it die simply because it never got the chance to live honestly. Ethan said nothing, and when she stood to leave, he didn't stop her. But his eyes, just for a second, followed her steps, and in them, there flickered the faintest light, like the last ember before dawn. And when the door closed behind her, Ethan slowly raised his hand to his chest, to where his heart still beat. Faint, but alive. And this time, instead of pushing it away, he let his palm rest there, for a long, long time. As if asking, if I had one more chance, who could I live for? The night before the surgery, the hospital felt breathlessly still. A willow tree swayed gently outside the lower terrace, casting faint shadows across the concrete. The sky was ash gray, no stars, no moon, as if the universe was holding its breath for something about to happen, or not. On the 17th floor, the room lights were still on. Ethan was awake. He lay on his side, staring out the fogged window pane. The cold seeped into his joints, but it didn't chill him, like the emptiness that tugged at his chest. The surgical consent form still sat untouched on the bedside table, unsigned. It was the 4th time they'd brought it in. The 4th time Ethan picked up the pen and set it down. Not out of fear, but because no one had ever taught him how to keep living. When a heart had no reason left to beat, Amara stood in the hallway watching the status light from a distance. Her shift had ended, but she hadn't left. Her fingers laced together still. Inside her something trembled, not out of duty, but something quieter, deeper, like the breath of someone standing at the edge, not quite ready to let go. She strolled to room 1701. She didn't knock, just leaned gently against the wall listening. There was no sound from inside, but somehow she knew Ethan was awake, and maybe waiting. The door opened slowly. Ethan turned his head. Under the soft yellow glow, Amara stepped inside. Her eyes held no judgment, no pity, only a quiet stillness, like the surface of a lake that had finally stopped trying to reflect the moon. "I can't sleep," Ethan said. Amara pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "Neither can I." A long silence stretched between them. No one forced anything. No questions. No reassurances. Just two people side by side, on a night where life and death quietly took turns at the door. Ethan looked at his hands, the thin veins, the bones etched with age. At what point had he stopped recognizing himself? He couldn't remember. "If I don't wake up after the surgery," he began. But Amara interrupted gently. "You will. No. If." She didn't respond right away. She met his eyes not with bravado, but with a calmness strong enough to bear what others avoided. Ethan continued, his voice low, like night wind passing through stone. "I'm not afraid of dying, Amara. I'm afraid of waking up and not knowing who I am anymore. Of not knowing why I'm alive. Of having no one to remember, no one to call out to." Amara's eyes drifted toward the photo of Connor still resting quietly on the shelf. Then she turned back to Ethan and said softly, "If you're still afraid of losing something, it means you still want to live." Ethan didn't argue, because he knew she was right. All these days, she had never asked him to become someone else, never demanded he confess or trust her. She simply stayed. Not out of pressure, but because she chose to. And that was what cracked the strongest wall in him. "Do you think," he whispered, "we met too late?" Amara didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, her face softened by the muted light. And for a moment, she no longer looked like a nurse tending to a patient, but a quiet dream that had come to sit beside his life. "It's not too late," she said. "It's just the moment you finally needed someone who wouldn't leave." Ethan looked at her, a long, lingering gaze as if trying to memorize the delicate lines of her face, the slender jaw, bare lips, the arch of her brows, and the eyes carrying the silent depth of someone who had walked through her grief. In that moment, words could no longer reach what hovered between them. But in the stillness, something quiet and astonishing happened. Ethan reached out, not quickly, not confidently, as if his hand was inching toward a land he'd never touched. Amara didn't ask, didn't hesitate. She raised her hand and met his. They held hands, not tightly, not trembling, just enough for one soul to know it was no longer alone. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the room glowed with quiet warmth, reflected on white walls, in the curls of Amara's hair, and in Ethan's eyes where for the first time light stayed. He gently squeezed her hand like a silent pause between a tired symphony's long white spaces. "If I wake up," he said, his voice softer than rain, "be the first face I see." Amara didn't cry. She only nodded. Her lips pressed together, holding a promise that didn't need to be spoken. And that night, for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore slept. A real sleep, with someone holding his hand, someone who stayed. That morning, New York City lay damp and gray like a cold cloth spread across the sky. Ambulances sped along the avenues, their sirens slicing through the soft drizzle. But on the 17th floor of Whitestone Hospital, everything was still like a locked drawer that no one dared to open. Operating Room 3 had been prepared early. Overhead lights gleamed with a sterile sharpness, blades of illumination that seemed to cut open the soul before even touching skin. The air smelled of antiseptic latex gloves and murmurs in clinical tones. Here, emotions were left outside, hanging behind sterile gowns and surgical masks. At 7:10 a.m., Ethan Whitmore was wheeled in. His eyes were half open, not afraid, but not serene either. Just searching for one thing before the doors closed. And there she was, Amara, standing at the far end of the hallway, hands gently clasped together. They said no words, but her barely perceptible nod, the soft rise of her brows, as if to hold him back one more second, was the promise he carried into battle. "Prepare anesthesia. Vitals stable. Scalpel." Dr. Hamilton's voice rang out, even controlled each incision, each movement exact as if every feeling had been hung up with his coat. But inside Ethan's open chest, his heart carried a rhythm that belonged to no surgery, but to a hand held in the dark just hours before. Meanwhile, in the quiet waiting area for hospital staff, Amara sat alone on a faded plastic chair. The early light caught her face, illuminating a kind of worry that didn't cry, didn't tremble, but cut sharp like raindrops, clinging to lashes that hadn't blinked in a while. She didn't pray. She didn't cry. She sat there, her hand pressed lightly over her own heart, as if somehow she could send warmth back through the memory of that hand she'd held. She had never waited for anyone in a surgical lounge, never believed her presence could be the reason someone chose to live. Until yesterday, inside the OR, the procedure reached its most delicate phase. A 20-centimeter incision had been made. The rib cage was fixed open with steel clamps. Ethan's heart lay exposed, not bleeding much, but pale like something that had forgotten how to want to beat. Heart rate dropping. Prepare crash cart. Adrenaline, 1 nimbilities. ECG slow, delayed response. The overhead light glared, reflected in sweat gathering on brows. No one spoke of fear, but it grew tight and invisible, threading its way between every breath. That heart, once filled with power, wealth, legacy, now fought for one thing alone: the right to be loved. Amara didn't move. Her hand never left her chest. She couldn't hear what was happening inside, but her body felt it, a strange instinct, sharp and silent, that something had crossed into a point of no return. A cold wind swept through the hallway. She shivered. Then, her phone buzzed. One line from the surgical assistant: "His heart has stopped." In the depths of anesthesia, where light and medication blended into fog, Ethan found himself in a white room, and Connor was there, smiling, not angry, not asking why, just reaching out like Amara had done the night before. Ethan stepped forward, one step, then stopped, and he turned back. Behind him there was no hospital, no machines, no alarms. Just a woman on a faded chair, hands over her heart, waiting without a sound. He understood. Connor's voice soft as breath. "I'm already gone. But you're not. She needs you the way I once did." Outside, the warning light flashed red. Inside, Ethan's heart flatlined for precisely 17 seconds. 17 seconds. Not long in a lifetime, but long enough to decide whether there would be more. Hearts responding, rhythm returning. Oxygen levels rising, continue with graft. "We can proceed." The stillness shattered like waves crashing back against stone. Dr. Hamilton exhaled slowly, eyes still locked on the heart that had just stirred back to life. No one in the room knew what had pulled that heart back. No one saw the dream. No one heard the whisper of a brother. No one felt the silent nod of farewell, except Amara, still sitting, hand over her chest, as if somewhere her heart had been beating for him. 8:26 a.m. The digital clock in the waiting room kept ticking forward as it always did. But to Amara, every passing second felt like another silent ache beneath her ribs. She hadn't left the chair. No break room, no breakfast, no phone call. She sat upright, eyes locked on the closed doors, marked in bold red, "Authorized personnel only." She never imagined she would be sitting here not for family, but for a man who once showed no trace of emotion. A man who said he had nothing left to live for. But last night, in a breath barely above a whisper, he had taken her hand and said, "If I wake up, be the first face I see." And that one sentence, it was enough to carry her into this seemingly impossible wait. In the operating room, the tension was taut as piano wire. Ethan's heart had restarted, but it was still weak. Dr. Hamilton, a man with 2 decades of surgical experience, felt for the first time that something beyond medicine was guiding the room. Something unexplainable, but undeniable. The will of the patient. The operation had entered its second hour. The primary artery was exposed. The hardened valve needed replacement. And every incision, every contact with the heart muscle felt like touching his past. No one said it aloud, but everyone could feel it. Ethan's body wasn't resisting, but it also hadn't thoroughly chosen to return. As if even his heart was still unsure whether it deserved to be healed. Out in the hallway, Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. The one Ethan had once kept on his bedside shelf. The one she had seen. The one he had told her not to touch. And the one he later, in a moment of unspoken trust, had left in her care. The edges were frayed, colors fading. 2 blonde boys smiled under a soft summer sun. Ethan was the older one, eyes already carrying the seed of solitude. Connor was the younger, and his grin looked like it had never been broken. Amara stared at the picture for a long time, not to analyze it, but to remember it. "I'm already gone. But you're not." The whisper rang in her chest. She couldn't tell whose voice it was, Connor's or is Ethan trying to find his way back. 9:12 a.m. The surgery continued. Ethan's heart kept beating barely, each pulse as thin as a thread, as if any moment could snap the line between him and life. Dr. Hamilton leaned closer. This wasn't a routine procedure anymore. It had become something else, a quiet conversation between a surgeon and a soul on the edge. Prepare to attach the new valve, he ordered. The microsutures began, every movement like threading silk, one misstep, and it would all unravel. Amara rose, photo still in hand. She walked to the hallway window and looked down at the small hospital garden, the place where she used to read during breaks. Now it looked washed out by rain. Branches swayed, leaves fell soundlessly. She thought of the first time she met Ethan, the man who had stared blankly at the ceiling, whose eyes had reflected nothing but cold detachment. And then the cracks had appeared, a glance, a question, a confession, a hand held in the dark. Now that same man lay somewhere between life and death, and there was nothing she could do. But wait. No one talks about how lonely it is to sit outside an operating room. It's not pain. It's not fear. It's like sitting in the middle of an endless sea, unsure where the shore is, knowing only that someone you care about is drifting farther, and all your hope lies in whether they choose to keep swimming. 9:46 a.m. Valve secured. Begin removing chest spreaders. Ethan's heart began to stabilize. The monitor's beeping became more rhythmic, like a clock ticking back into time. Dr. Hamilton exhaled, but kept his eyes steady. Sometimes you can save a heart, but you can't be sure it still wants to beat. Monitor post-anesthesia reflexes. Prepare for recovery. Nearly 3 hours of battle, and they were finally beginning to land. Amara returned to her seat, fingers tightening around the photograph. Her palm was damp with sweat, but she didn't notice. She only looked toward the door, the one he'd be wheeled through. She didn't know when he would wake, didn't know if he'd remember what they'd said or the looks they'd shared. But she knew with a certainty that didn't need proof he had chosen to come back. Not for survival, not for medicine, but for something far more fragile and far more powerful. Someone was still waiting. The recovery room was bathed in soft, milky light, not as harsh as the OR, not as dim as a midnight ward, just enough to reveal a body slowly returning from the edge between life and death. Ethan lay still. The breathing machine hummed rhythmically. A line of stitches ran down the center of his chest, a clear sign that his heart had been opened and sewn back together. But the concern wasn't the scar. The real question lingered behind his still closed eyelids. What would he remember, and what had already drifted too far? Amara sat beside his bed. She had waited 4 hours since Ethan was wheeled out of surgery. In that time, she hadn't called anyone, hadn't eaten, hadn't moved. She just sat, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the monitor, watching for even the most minor shift. She wasn't waiting for a movie miracle awakening. She was waiting and believing that if a man who once rejected life had chosen to come back, then surely something within him still wasn't ready to be forgotten. A sudden beep, slightly off rhythm, just enough to make Amara bolt upright. Ethan twitched, his right index finger curled barely. Then his eyelids fluttered. For the first time in nearly 4 hours, Ethan opened his eyes. The light stung. He winced as the ceiling blurred across his vision. He closed them again, then slowly reopened, this time slower. His gaze turned sideways and landed on a familiar silhouette. Amara. She didn't rush toward him. She stood there, half a step between holding on and letting go. She didn't know if he truly saw her, or stared through her like mist on glass. Ethan blinked. Then he turned his face away. A quiet clench closed around Amara's chest. Not from anger, but from fear. Fear that he didn't remember. I didn't remember her voice at night. Didn't remember the cold hand nestled in hers. Didn't remember the final whisper before the surgery. If I wake up, be the first face I see. She stepped closer slowly. Ethan, I'm here. No response. His eyes shut again, as if all his energy had been drained simply by surviving. Amara placed her hand on the bed rail near his hand, but not touching. Just close enough so that if he wanted, he could reach. Do you know who I am? She asked, voice low, quiet as a winter lake. Ethan didn't open his eyes, but his brow twitched subtle, a sign that couldn't be called remembering, but wasn't quite forgetting either. Amara exhaled, softly, then sat down again, silent, patient, like a gatekeeper, holding space for a soul trying to find its way back. Nearly 2 hours later, Ethan opened his eyes again. This time he looked directly at her. No confusion, no surprise, just emptiness, as if two versions of reality were colliding in his mind, one that still held a scent of memory and one that hadn't yet formed its name. I woke up, he whispered. His lips were dry. Amara nodded. You did. You came back. A pause. Then he asked, why are you here? It wasn't a stranger's question. It was the question of someone who knew something once, but had dropped it somewhere on the road back. Amara smiled a sad, soft smile, like sunlight barely lingering on a gray afternoon. Because you once asked me to wait. Ethan stared at her. For a long time. His storm-gray eyes no longer cold, not yet clear, but within them something was stirring. He said nothing more. But as Amara stood to leave, he raised his hand, the same hand that had held hers in the dark. This time, he didn't reach out to grab. He just opened his palm, hesitant, unspoken, waiting for her to fill that space again. And Amara, without asking, without repeating anything, placed her hand into his. In that moment, no memories were needed. No names, no past, just a single touch. And the heart knew it had come home. The afternoon light tilted softly through the hospital window, casting pale golden beams on the white tile floor, like sunlight falling from a place no one could name. The recovery room remained hushed, its quiet broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor, a silent soundtrack to a life inching its way back from the brink. Ethan Whitmore opened his eyes for the third time since the surgery. This time his gaze was no longer clouded by anesthesia, nor lost in confusion. It was clear, sharp, like a man who once lost all direction, now tracing his way home. He didn't ask where he was or who he was. Instead, he turned his head to the right slowly and saw her. Amara was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her white coat folded neatly on her lap, her curls resting gently over one shoulder, her head leaning toward the plastic chair back. She no longer looked like a nurse. She looked like someone who had waded through both light and darkness, through fear and pain, through dreams and reality. Ethan stared at her, without blinking, without sighing, just staring as if replaying that last moment before he slipped under, the hand in the dark, the whispered voice, the final image seared into his mind. This face, these eyes. He moved his fingers. The sensation was slow but real. He was alive. Amara stirred. Her back ached from leaning over too long. She lifted her head and met his eyes and froze. Ethan was already watching her, unblinking, unmoved. Between them, silence stretched, a silence heavy enough to hold everything left unsaid. Amara placed a hand on the bed rail, trying to steady her breath. How are you feeling? Ethan didn't respond right away. He glanced at the ceiling, then back at her. "Tired," he murmured. "But I don't think I've ever felt more awake." Amara nodded. "The doctor said the surgery was successful. Your heart responded well. Stable rhythm. You need a few more days to rest." Ethan closed his eyes for a beat, as if letting her words sink in. Your heart responded well. His heart, a machine that had known nothing but ambition for years, was now beating. Not for power, not for legacy, but for something softer, more fragile, more real. He opened his eyes, meeting hers, and then, in a voice raw from strain and truth, he whispered, "You're the reason I want to keep living." The words weren't loud. They weren't a grand confession wrapped in poetry. They were a fact, a quiet truth, like an old white shirt worn softly over time, but still fitting perfectly. Amara didn't speak right away. She sat still, her hand inching toward his, toward the thin wrist, with faint veins trembling slightly under new life. "I'm not sure why," Ethan continued, voice cracking. "But when my heart was about to stop, I saw you, not in memory, but somewhere beyond, like an anchor point, a place to come back to." Amara remained silent, but her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with knowing. Her entire being whispered, "He remembers." I didn't believe in anything before, Ethan said. "But I believe in how you sat by me in the dark. No promises, no conditions. You just stayed." He raised his hand gently, brushing the leather bracelet around her wrist, the one she never took off. Just like her quiet faith in him. "I used to think living was a race," he whispered. "But you made me realize sometimes living simply allows your heart to break and still be held." Amara's lips pressed into a soft line. "You don't need to remember everything," she said. "Just remember this: you're not alone anymore." A silence fell again. But this time it wasn't empty. Ethan smiled for the first time in months, and maybe the first time not born of success. "You're the only one who never asked me how much money I have." Amara grinned. "I still don't want to know." They both laughed, a soft, brief moment, but enough to warm the sterile white of the recovery room. Enough to prove some resurrections don't come from medicine, but from presence. From the right words, from the right person. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, but the light carried a different hue, softer, gentler, as if it too had survived a storm and still had enough warmth left to shine on two people holding hands in a quiet room. Ethan's heart, newly stitched, still fragile, beat, not just to keep him alive. It beat because someone made him want to live. 12 days after the surgery, Ethan Whitmore took his first steps. There were no trumpets, no flowers, no press waiting outside the door. Just one person standing beside him, her hand holding his with a gentleness that said more than any word could. Amara, in her simple nurse uniform, her eyes quiet and steady. Ethan didn't need anyone to support him. He just needed to know someone was there. It was the first step after a major operation. But more than that, it was the first step into a second life he never thought he'd have. After being discharged, Ethan didn't return to his Manhattan penthouse. That high-rise apartment still stood silent, glassy, a mausoleum of wealth and loneliness. But he had no desire to return to a place where every chair and every picture frame echoed emptiness. Instead, he chose a small riverside town on the outskirts of Beacon, a place where the sunlight felt gentler. The air was clear enough to hear leaves rustle in the morning, and quiet enough for a freshly stitched heart to learn how to live again. No one knew why Ethan chose Beacon. Only Amara understood. He needed a place with no echoes of power, no glances of judgment, and most importantly, no old memories, On the first day in his rented cottage, Ethan stood at the window and looked out at the garden. It wasn't much. The grass was high and the soil was dry. But he didn't see barrenness. He saw the possibility, the kind that invited a beginning. Every morning, Amara arrived with 2 cups of hot tea and an old sweater. She didn't ask what he needed. She just sat beside him on the porch steps and drank tea in silence, listening to the leaves fall. The wind passes by. Ethan didn't say much. He didn't need to. Neither did she. Between them, words had long become unnecessary. Days passed. Ethan began doing things he never used to do. Brewing his tea, folding his blanket, planting a small flower bed behind the house. He gave the plants names, not fancy ones, just Connor, Clara, and a small pot named Amara. She laughed when she found out. "I didn't think I was the type that could be planted," she teased. Ethan smiled, a habit he was slowly relearning. "Because you're the kind that makes everything else grow." 3 weeks later, Ethan received an email from his legal team: transition plans for the company, unfinished investments, invitations to return to the business world complete with an honorary title. He read everything, then shut the laptop. Didn't respond. Didn't rage. Didn't formally resign. Just simply no longer cared. Ethan used to believe he was born to lead, dominate, and silence rooms. But after having his heart cracked open and stitched back together, he realized there's no greater power than choosing to live simply and gratefully. Amara never asked what he planned to do next. She wasn't a woman who needed 5-year goals. She only needed to know that each morning, when Ethan woke up, he would step outside, look at the flowers and say, "The tea smells better than yesterday." And each time, she would sit beside him, pour the tea without ceremony or porcelain, just 2 souls sharing the warmest kind of silence. One evening, as they sat on a stone bench, watching the Hudson River turn amber with sunset, Ethan spoke softly. "You know, I used to think the world needed me." Amara looked at him, didn't nod, didn't shake her head. But in the end, he said, "I realized I was the one who needed a world small enough to see just one person. And you're that world." Amara didn't cry, but something in her eyes softened like silk caught in the wind, leaving a gentle crease in something once unyielding. When Ethan reached for her hand, there was no hesitation. There are no questions about status, distance, or definitions of us. Just a hand. The same hand that once rested on his chest when his heart was failing. The same hand that gripped his in the dark before surgery. The same hand now resting calmly in his, a quiet confirmation that this second life had truly begun. April arrived in the quiet riverside town of Beacon, with soft sunlight and the scent of damp earth after the first spring rains. Wild cherry blossoms bloomed along the roadside, brushing the pale blue sky with gentle pink, like silk strokes on a canvas. Ethan had been walking more lately. He told Amara that his steps were no longer about running from the past, but walking towards something that no longer scared him. She didn't ask what that something was, because she knew. He never spoke of things he wasn't yet ready to believe in. Until that morning, Ethan began preparing early. No extravagance, no fanfare. He rose before the sunlight touched the windows, brewed chamomile tea by hand, and laid it on a wooden tray, beside a small piece of waffle cake, Amara's favorite. It was routine, but he turned it into a silent ritual, the kind of man uses when learning how to say something important without saying too much. He sent her a simple message. "Could you come to the garden at 7? No flowers, no emojis. Yet something in that text made Amara choose to wear her long white dress, a birthday gift from her mother, that she had never found the right moment for. She stepped out of the guest house exactly at 7. Ethan was already waiting in the garden, where the flower beds they had planted together began blooming quietly. He wore a white shirt, sleeves neatly rolled up, not the image of a powerful CEO who once ruled boardrooms, but of a man who had just awakened from a long dream, and now understood the only thing worth holding on to was the person walking toward him. Amara walked forward, saying nothing. Ethan reached out his hand, and she placed hers in it, just like before, like always, like she never needed to be asked. In the center of the garden, an old wooden bench had been placed. On it sat a small box, no velvet, no ribbon. Beside it, a portable heart monitor, compact, silent, and resting there as if it had a part to play. Amara looked down, slightly puzzled. "What are you doing?" she asked gently. Ethan didn't answer right away. He picked up the monitor and handed it to her. "Do you remember that night in the hospital?" he said, "when you placed your hand on my chest?" She nodded quietly. "I thought my heart was stopping, but really, it was just waiting for a reason to keep beating." He turned the monitor on and slipped the sensor onto his index finger. The screen lit up, slow but steady. A heartbeat. They looked at it, watching the numbers pulse softly under the early morning light. And then, with sunlight and flowers and silent memory all around them, Ethan spoke. "This heartbeat once stopped. And you brought it back. Today, I want to ask you something. Not with flowers, not with diamonds, but with this heartbeat you saved." He removed the device, placed it in her hand, and stepped forward. The sun hit his hair, highlighting the silver strands, reminders of time and pain once endured. And then Ethan knelt, one knee, eyes level with hers. "Amara Jackson, would you be the only one to hear my heartbeat every morning for the rest of my life?" Sure. There was no applause, no cameras, no string quartet in the background, no fairy lights or staged scenes. Just a question, asked by a man who had let go of everything he once was, and a woman who had stayed silent through the entire journey, but now had learned how to answer. Amara stood still for a moment. In her eyes, a light shimmered, soft and damp, like sunlight passing through water and touching the most tender parts of the soul. "I don't know how many years I'll get to hear your heart," she whispered. "But I know one thing for sure. I won't ever let it beat alone again." Ethan exhaled, a slow, weightless breath, as if something heavy had finally lifted from his chest. He stood, no rush. The heart monitor was still in his hand, once a tool for tracking life, now a symbol of love. That night, there was no celebration. Just the two of them sharing dinner under the porch roof, cutting a slice of plum pie and sipping ginger tea from a vintage ceramic teapot Ethan had found at an old thrift store. No rings, no grand announcements. Just a heart once fractured, once refusing, once lost, now cradled in the hands of someone who never tried to own it, but quietly kept it safe. That year, summer came early. The skies over New York were unusually gentle, as if the city had finally learned to smile after a long, bitter winter. Along the sidewalks of Whitestone Memorial Hospital, trees unfurled their baby green leaves in the early light, like time whispering with tiny fingers. Every rebirth is worth it. That morning, in a modest courtyard behind the main building, once used only by nurses and patients for fresh air, now gently veiled in white linen, soft as morning mist. There were no rose-covered arches, no string quartets, no celebrity guests, just a few plain wooden chairs. And in the middle, two people. A black nurse, hair neatly tied back her eyes, still as the morning sky. And a man once a billionaire, once emotionally exiled, once convinced he didn't deserve love, now stood beneath the trees, wearing a white shirt, hand-steady eyes, certain. Ethan Whitmore, a man who once let go of life, now standing here waiting for a lifetime vow. Amara didn't wear a wedding dress. She wore a soft, beige linen gown, flat shoes, and the same old leather bracelet around her wrist, the one that had followed her through every mile of this journey. Ethan had once asked why she didn't throw it away. Because it's the only proof, she said, that I survived every pain and still believe. And today, it remains there, a silent witness to everything they had endured. The officiant was Dr. Hamilton, head of the cardiology unit, the very doctor who had once stood over Ethan's chest as his heart fought its way back to life. He wasn't in his white coat today, no clipboard in hand, only a small stack of papers and eyes warm with something close to pride. "We won't recite long vows," he said gently, "because everything that needed proving, you've already proved with your lives." Ethan took Amara's hand. Not like the first time, not in desperation. Do not hesitate before surgery. This time it was the grasp of a man who had found clarity. If his heart still beat, it was beating towards someone. "I won't promise to be the perfect husband," Ethan said, never breaking eye contact. "I don't have a roadmap for marriage or poetic words for the future. But I do know one thing for sure." He gently guided her hand to his chest, where the surgical scar still marked the spot his heart had once given up. Then they were chosen to come back. "If my heart ever falters again, your hand is the only one that could keep it here." Amara nodded, her voice soft, trembling but unwavering. "And I'll be there. Not because I have to, but because I chose to be the one who listens to your heart in every beat, even the weakest ones." There was a round of quiet applause from behind. A few former colleagues, a couple of Amara's old patients, even some of Ethan's former associates, now silent observers at a wedding that was never announced. No one cried, but everyone fell silent because they knew some loves don't need music or spectacle. They need to be steady, like a calm, even breath. That evening, Ethan and Amara didn't take a honeymoon trip. They returned to the small garden behind their rented home in Beacon. They watered flowers, shared a quiet dinner on the porch, and discussed planting more lavender bushes. Ethan placed a wooden bench under the cherry tree, his favorite spot. "I want to sit here every morning," he said, "and listen to my heart, not with a monitor, but through her presence." And Amara, instead of calling him Mr. Whitmore, as she once had, tilted her head, smiled, and said, "Ethan." His name in her voice was no longer a name from the past, but a complete present blooming with every passing day. On Amara's wrist, the old leather bracelet had been replaced with something slimmer, engraved with two lines, "Still I rise, because you held me when I fell." A man was born again that day, not through medicine, not through wealth, but through love, through a hand that never chained him, but also never let go. That if you followed this story to its final word, perhaps your heart too paused somewhere. At a glance, a hand held in silence, a single fragile heartbeat, enough to remind us. Sometimes what brings someone back to life isn't the healing itself, but someone who chooses to stay. If this story touched you, tap that like button, so I know the quiet things still get heard. Share your thoughts below about love, about loss, or even something you once chose to hold on to, no matter how fragile. And if you'd like to walk through more stories of healing, subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the right story at the right time, it's all a heart needs to beat a little stronger.